A boy born on a small Mediterranean island would one day rule most of Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte's empire rose from nothing to dominate a continent, then fell into ruin almost as quickly as it began. By the end of this video, you will understand how one man's ambition and genius built a system that reshaped the world, only to shatter under its own weight. What drove him to conquer vast lands? What exactly caused that staggering collapse? And how did a Corsican outsider become a legend whose shadow still stretches across history? How far should ambition push before it becomes too much? The island of Corsica had only belonged to France for a single year when Napoleon Bonaparte was born in Ajaccio on August 15, 1769. His family belonged to the minor nobility, a status that offered respect but little wealth. The Corsica itself had a fierce independent spirit, and its recent transfer from Genoa to France created a complicated identity for young Napoleon. He grew up speaking a Corsican dialect, and his early years were shaped by the island's rugged landscape and proud history of resistance. At the age of 9, he was sent to mainland France to attend a military school in Brienne. There, he was an outsider, short, intense, and often mocked for his accent. But he found refuge in books. He devoured works on military strategy, ancient history, and the philosophy of the Enlightenment. Thinkers like Rousseau and Voltaire filled his mind with ideas about order, reason, and the potential for great individuals to reshape society. His ambition became a quiet fire. He studied the campaigns of Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Frederick the Great, memorizing tactics and dreaming of his own triumphs. By the time he moved to the École Militaire in Paris, he had already decided that he would not remain a minor noble from a small island. The French Revolution erupted when he was 20, and it threw the old world into chaos. For a young artillery officer with talent and hunger, that chaos was an opportunity. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant at 16, but it was the revolution that accelerated his rise. As the monarchy fell and the nation called for defenders, Napoleon's education, ambition, and cold calculation placed him exactly where history needed him. But how did a lonely Corsican boy turn the fire of revolution into a ladder to absolute power? The French Revolution smashed the old structures of power. Nobility no longer guaranteed promotion. Talent, ambition, and loyalty to the revolutionary cause became the true currency of advancement. For a young man like Napoleon, this was a world turned upside down, and he was ready to climb. His early military postings were uneventful, but he made sure to stay connected with the radical Jacobin faction in Paris. They were the firebrands of the revolution, and Napoleon understood that aligning with them could open doors. In 1793, he found his chance. The port city of Toulon had rebelled against the revolutionary government and handed itself over to the British and Spanish fleets. The Republic needed to retake the city, and the task fell to the army. Napoleon, then a captain of artillery, was assigned to the siege. He did not lead the entire operation. He was one officer among many, but he saw something others missed. The key to Toulon was a small fortification called Fort Les Guillettes. It commanded the harbor. If the French could seize that point, their cannons could bombard the enemy ships into retreat. Napoleon argued his case to the senior commanders, and they let him try. He positioned his guns with precision, aiming not at the city walls, but at the naval anchorage. After days of bombardment and a daring assault, the fort fell. The British fleet, fearing destruction, withdrew. Toulon was recaptured. Napoleon Bonaparte, only 24 years old, was promoted to brigadier general on the spot. He had not just won a battle. He had proven that his mind for strategy worked in the chaos of real war. The revolution rewarded competence, and now the entire military establishment knew his name. But a single victory does not secure a future. How would he hold on to his newfound rank when the political winds of revolutionary France shifted so violently? The cannons at Toulon were not placed by luck. They were placed by a young officer who saw what no one else saw. While other commanders studied the city walls and prepared for a direct assault, Napoleon studied the coastline. He climbed the hills above the harbor, noting every curve of the shore, every ridge, every patch of high ground. What he discovered was a fundamental flaw in the enemy's defense. The British and Spanish fleets anchored in the inner harbor believed themselves safe behind the city's fortifications. But there was a small peninsula called the promontory of Les Guillettes that jutted out into the water. Whoever held that point commanded the entire anchorage. The existing fort on that spot was old and weak. But Napoleon knew that if he could seize it and mount heavy artillery there, his cannons would be able to reach every enemy ship at anchor. The British would have no choice but to flee or be destroyed piece by piece. He presented this plan to the senior generals, but they were skeptical. They had already tried a conventional siege and failed. Napoleon insisted with the calm certainty of a man who had already run every calculation in his head. He argued that the key was not the city, but the harbor. The generals, desperate for any plan that might work, finally gave him permission to try. He moved his guns under cover of darkness, positioning them on the heights with painstaking precision. When the bombardment began, the British commander realized the danger immediately. The young artillery officer had created a killing zone. The enemy fleet weighed anchor and fled the harbor, leaving the city to fall. It was a stunning victory, and it happened because Napoleon had read the terrain like a book. He had not just seen a hill, he had seen a battlefield that no one else had noticed. The Committee of Public Safety in Paris, the revolutionary government that ruled France with an iron grip, took notice. They needed generals who could win, and this Corsican outsider had just handed them a major triumph. They promoted him to brigadier general, but more importantly, they began to see him as a rising star, a man whose strategic mind could be trusted with greater responsibilities. The siege of Toulon was not just a battle. It was the moment when Napoleon Bonaparte stopped being a promising officer and became a name that people whispered with respect. The revolution rewarded talent, and he had just proven that he possessed it in abundance. But a single victory, no matter how brilliant, was only the beginning. The real test would come in the chaotic years ahead, when France needed a leader who could do more than fire cannons. That test arrived in 1796, when Napoleon was given command of the army of Italy. On paper, it looked like a punishment. The army was starving, poorly equipped, and stationed in the foothills of the Alps, facing a much larger and better supplied Austrian force. The revolutionary government in Paris, the Directory, had sent him there partly to get him out of the capital, where his growing reputation made them uneasy. But Napoleon saw opportunity where others saw failure. He did not waste time complaining about the conditions. Instead, he gave his soldiers a promise: "You are hungry and ill-clothed, but I will lead you into the richest plains of Italy, where honor and glory await." That speech electrified the troops. Within weeks, he transformed a dispirited mob into a motivated fighting force. He understood that morale depended not just on food, but on belief in a leader who shared their hardship and offered a vision. He moved his army with a speed that shocked the Austrians. Instead of attacking their main defensive line directly, he slipped through the narrow coastal passes and struck at the seams between enemy columns. At Montenotte in April, he isolated a portion of the Austrian army and crushed it in a single day. It was a classic use of interior lines. He concentrated his own forces against a smaller part of the enemy while the rest could not react in time. The Austrians, expecting a slow, cautious campaign, found themselves outflanked and outrun. Next came Lodi, where Napoleon personally led a charge across a narrow bridge under heavy fire. That moment became legendary. It cemented his bond with his soldiers, who saw him risk his life alongside them. He was not a distant commander. He was the man in the smoke, pushing forward. The victory at Lodi gave him control of Lombardy and opened the road to Milan. But the Austrians were not finished. They regrouped and counterattacked at Arcole, where the fighting turned into a brutal 3-day struggle across marshes and causeways. Napoleon again exposed himself to danger, grabbing a regimental flag and rallying his men at the bridge. The battle was a near thing, but his relentless pressure finally broke the Austrian will. By the end of 1796, he had driven the Austrians out of most of northern Italy. He then turned south, forcing the Papal States and other Italian states to sue for peace. And here is where the political brilliance emerged. Instead of simply occupying territory, Napoleon treated the Italian cities as liberated allies. He set up republican governments modeled on France's own revolution, complete with elected assemblies and civil equality. He also extracted enormous sums of money and art treasures, sending them back to Paris as trophies. This made him immensely popular at home, not just as a general, but as a provider of wealth and glory. The Directory in Paris grew jealous. They had sent him to Italy, hoping he would fail, or at least stay away. Instead, he was becoming more powerful than they were. By 1797, he had pushed all the way to the gates of Vienna. The Austrians, exhausted, agreed to negotiate. The resulting Treaty of Campo Formio, signed in October of that year, gave France control over Belgium, the left bank of the Rhine, and much of northern Italy. Napoleon did not consult the Directory on the key terms. He negotiated directly with the Austrian emperor, acting as if he were the sovereign of a separate state. When the treaty was ratified, he returned to Paris as a conquering hero. Crowds lined the streets. Artists painted his portrait. Songs were written in his honor. The Directory welcomed him publicly, but privately feared him. He had become a national hero, with his own army loyal to him, not to the government. He had also proven that he could win wars on his own terms, without orders from Paris. The question now was simple. What would a man who had conquered Italy and overshadowed his own government do next? The answer came in 1798, when he launched an expedition to Egypt. On the surface, it seemed like a wild gamble. Why would a man who had just conquered Italy and made peace with Austria suddenly sail across the Mediterranean to invade a province of the Ottoman Empire? The real target was not the pyramids or the sands of Cairo. It was Britain. Napoleon believed that by conquering Egypt, he could threaten the British route to India, the jewel of their empire. If he could cut that link, he could cripple British trade and force London to the negotiating table. It was a daring strategic concept, and the French Directory, still uneasy about his popularity at home, was happy to send him far away. They gave him an army of over 30,000 men, a fleet of hundreds of ships, and a cargo of scholars, scientists, and artists. This was not just a military campaign. It was an expedition of discovery wrapped in the ambitions of empire. The fleet sailed from Toulon in May of 1798. On the way, Napoleon captured the island of Malta, a strategic fortress held by the Knights of St. John. He took it almost without a fight, using a combination of negotiation and overwhelming force. Then he pressed on toward Egypt, landing near Alexandria in early July. The Mamluk rulers who controlled Egypt were unprepared for this sudden invasion. They had heard rumors of a French fleet, but they underestimated its speed. Napoleon marched his army inland toward Cairo, across the desert under a blazing sun. His soldiers suffered from thirst and heat, but he drove them forward with discipline and promises of glory. On July 21st, they reached the village of Mbabe, near the pyramids. There, the Mamluk army waited, thousands of cavalry on horseback, their swords gleaming in the morning light. What followed became known as the Battle of the Pyramids. Napoleon organized his infantry into hollow squares, a classic formation that turned the army into a fortress of bayonets and musket fire. The Mamluk cavalry charged with terrifying speed, but they crashed against these squares again and again, unable to break through. The French artillery tore gaps in their ranks, and the disciplined volleys of the infantry cut them down. Within hours, the Mamluk army was shattered. Napoleon entered Cairo as a conqueror, but he also presented himself as a liberator. He issued proclamations in Arabic and Turkish, declaring that he respected Islam and had come to free the Egyptians from the tyranny of the Mamluks. It was a clever propaganda move, though it fooled few. The real power lay in his guns and his determination to remake Egypt as a French colony. But while Napoleon was winning on land, disaster struck at sea. The British Navy, under Admiral Horatio Nelson, had been hunting the French fleet across the Mediterranean. Nelson finally found it anchored in Aboukir Bay, near the mouth of the Nile, on August 1st, 1798. The French commander had positioned his ships close to the shore, believing that the shallow waters would protect his rear. Nelson saw a narrow gap and sent half his fleet to sail inside the French line, catching them between two fires. The battle raged through the night. The French flagship, the Orient, caught fire and exploded in a massive ball of flame that could be seen for miles. By morning, the French fleet lay destroyed. Napoleon and his army were now trapped in Egypt, cut off from France with no hope of reinforcement or return. This disaster did not break Napoleon's spirit. He continued his campaign, marching into Syria and laying siege to the fortress of Acre. But the British Navy supported the Ottoman defenders, and plague swept through his army. After months of failure, he was forced to retreat back to Egypt. Yet even in defeat, he kept his reputation intact. He carefully controlled the news that reached France, presenting his campaign as a series of heroic victories. The people back home did not learn of the naval disaster or the Syrian failure until much later. And here is where the story takes a sharp turn. Napoleon learned that the political situation in France had grown unstable. The Directory was weak, unpopular, and divided. Enemies at home and abroad threatened the revolution. He made a decision that showed his cold calculation. He abandoned his army in Egypt. He slipped away on a small frigate in August of 1799, leaving his soldiers behind under the command of his generals. He took only a handful of trusted officers and sailed through the British blockade, narrowly escaping capture. When he landed on the coast of southern France in October, He was greeted not as a deserter, but as a returning hero. The news of his arrival spread like wildfire. The French people, tired of corruption and failure, saw him as the only man who could save the nation. He had lost an army, but he had gained a country. The stage was now set for a dramatic transfer of power, one that would end the revolution and begin his personal rule. How would a general who abandoned his own soldiers seize control of France itself? The moment Napoleon set foot on French soil, the political machinery of the Republic began to shift. He knew that popularity alone would not give him power. He needed a plan, and he found his partner in Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, a veteran politician of the Revolution who had grown disillusioned with the corrupt and ineffective Directory. Sieyès had been quietly plotting a coup for months, searching for a general with enough fame and ambition to back his legal maneuver. Napoleon was the perfect choice, and the two men met in secret, sketching out a scheme that would dismantle the existing government and replace it with a strong executive led by Napoleon himself. They chose the date carefully, November 9th and 10th of 1799, according to the revolutionary calendar, the 18th and 19th of Brumaire. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. The Council of Ancients, the upper house of the legislature, would be convinced that a Jacobin conspiracy threatened the Republic. They would vote to move the sessions of both councils to the secure palace of Saint-Cloud on the outskirts of Paris and appoint Napoleon as commander of the troops in the capital. That would give him legal authority over the military. Then, under his protection, the councils would be forced to dissolve the Directory and create a new government with 3 consuls. Napoleon would be the first consul, holding all real power. On the morning of November 9th, everything proceeded smoothly. The Council of Ancients passed the decrees as planned. Napoleon assumed command of the troops and addressed the legislature with a speech that was, by all accounts, nervous and awkward. He stammered about loyalty to the Republic, but the deputies sensed something was wrong. The real trouble came the next day, November 10th, at the Palace of Saint-Cloud. The Council of the 500, the lower house, was not fooled. When Napoleon entered their chamber to address them, they exploded in fury. Deputies shouted at him, accusing him of ambition and treachery. Some grabbed him by the collar. Others called him a dictator and a tyrant. Guards had to pull him out of the room, shaken and pale. The coup seemed on the verge of collapse. But Napoleon had not come alone. His brother Lucien Bonaparte happened to be the president of the Council of the 500 that day. Lucien stood at the podium and refused to put the motion of outlawry against Napoleon to a vote. He stalled, arguing with the deputies, while outside the chamber, Napoleon's loyal soldiers waited. What happened next was a decisive stroke of theater. Lucien rushed outside and addressed the troops directly. He pointed to the building and shouted that the deputies were being held at knife point by a handful of paid agitators. He swore that Napoleon was the savior of the Republic, and he asked the soldiers to follow him. The grenadiers, loyal to their general, marched into the chamber with bayonets fixed. The deputies fled through the windows and doors, scattering into the gardens. The coup was complete. By the end of the day, the Directory was abolished. A provisional consulate was established with Napoleon, Sieyès, and another man named Ducos as consuls. But Sieyès quickly realized that he had created a machine that would not serve him. Napoleon drafted a new constitution, known as the Constitution of the Year 8, with himself as first consul. He held the power to appoint ministers, command the army, make treaties, and propose laws. CAS was pushed aside into a ceremonial role. The revolution had produced a general who now ruled France not as a king, but as a consul with absolute authority. The question that hung over the nation was simple. What would this new strongman do with the power he had just seized? The machinery of power was now in his hands, but a nation in chaos demanded more than just a strong leader. It demanded order, law, and a foundation that could hold. Napoleon understood that the revolution had swept away the old feudal privileges and ancient institutions, but it had left a void filled with confusion and conflict. The country needed a single, uniform set of rules that applied to every citizen, regardless of birth or wealth. So in the year 1800, he set his government to work on a project that would become his most lasting achievement: the Napoleonic Code. This was not just a list of laws. It was a complete rethinking of how justice should work. Before the code, France was a patchwork of local customs, royal decrees, and revolutionary edicts that varied from region to region. A person could be judged differently in Paris than in Marseille for the same act. The Napoleonic Code swept all of that away. It established clear principles: equality before the law, the protection of private property, freedom of conscience, and the right to choose one's profession. It abolished serfdom and feudal dues, making every citizen a free individual under the state. For the first time, a French farmer and a Parisian banker stood on the same legal ground. But the code was not a document of perfect liberty. It reflected Napoleon's own views on society, which were deeply conservative in certain areas. While it guaranteed equality for men, it severely restricted the rights of women. A married woman was legally placed under the authority of her husband. She could not own property, enter contracts, or even open a bank account without his permission. Divorce was allowed, but it was far easier for a man to obtain than for a woman. The code also restored slavery in the French colonies, which the Revolution had briefly abolished. These were not accidents. Napoleon believed that a stable society required a strong patriarchal family and a clear hierarchy. The code was a tool of control as much as a tool of justice. Alongside the legal reforms, Napoleon rebuilt the entire administration of France. The Revolution had broken the old system of provinces and replaced it with departments, but the central government in Paris was still weak and often ignored. Napoleon changed that. He appointed prefects to run each department, men loyal to him, who reported directly to the capital. These prefects controlled local police, tax collection, and public works. The result was a chain of command that reached from the first consul's desk all the way down to the smallest village. France became a tightly run machine, efficient and predictable. Money was the next problem. The revolution had left the treasury empty and the currency worthless. The government had printed paper money called assignats, which became so inflated that people used them as wallpaper. Napoleon needed to restore confidence. In 1800, he created the Bank of France, a single institution with the exclusive right to issue paper currency. He backed it with gold and silver reserves, and he placed it under strict government control. The bank lent money to businesses, stabilized the exchange rate, and gave merchants a reason to trust the economy again. It was not a central bank in the modern sense, but it was the seed from which France's financial stability grew. Education was another battlefield. The revolution had closed the old church schools and the universities, leaving a gap that no one had filled. Napoleon saw that a loyal nation needed educated citizens, but he did not want independent thinkers questioning his authority. so he created a new system of secondary schools called lycée. These were state-run boarding schools that taught a strict curriculum of mathematics, Latin, ancient history, and military discipline. The students wore uniforms and lived under a rigid daily schedule. The goal was to produce obedient administrators, engineers, and officers for the state. Knowledge was important, but loyalty was paramount. The lycées became the training grounds for the next generation of French leaders. Perhaps the most delicate reform of all was the Concordat of 1801 with the Catholic Church. The Revolution had tried to destroy the Church, confiscating its lands, executing priests, and establishing a cult of reason. The result was a deep rift between the faithful and the state. Napoleon, though personally skeptical of religion, saw that the Church could be a powerful ally in controlling the population. He negotiated a treaty with Pope Pius VII. The Concordat recognized Catholicism as the religion of the great majority of French citizens, not as the official state religion. The state would pay the salaries of bishops and priests, while the Church gave up its claims to the land seized during the Revolution. In return, the Pope agreed that the state could nominate bishops. Napoleon had effectively made the Church a department of the government. It was a brilliant compromise that healed the wound of the Revolution while keeping ultimate authority in his hands. Taken together, these reforms transformed France. The legal system was unified, the administration was centralized, the currency was stable, education was harnessed to the state, and the Church was pacified. After a decade of revolution and war, the country finally knew what to expect. A farmer could plant his fields knowing the laws would not change next year. A merchant could invest knowing the bank would honor its notes. A parent could send a child to school knowing they would learn useful skills. Napoleon had given France the order it craved, and in return, the people gave him their loyalty. But stability at home was only half the challenge. Across the continent, the old monarchies of Europe watched the rise of this new consul with deep suspicion. How long would they allow a revolutionary general to consolidate power before they tried to crush him again? The old monarchies of Europe did not wait long to test the new consul. In the year 1800, a coalition of Britain, Austria, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire formed against France. They believed that with a new leader at the helm, the Republic might be vulnerable. Napoleon moved faster than they expected. He crossed the Alps with an army, surprising the Austrians at Marengo in June of that year. The battle was nearly lost when a late arrival of reinforcements turned the tide. But Napoleon's personal courage and his ability to inspire his troops held the line. The victory shattered the coalition and forced Austria to sue for peace. By 1802, a fragile peace settled over Europe. But inside France, Napoleon's ambition had not settled. He used the calm to push his power even further. In 1802, a plebiscite made him first consul for life. The people voted overwhelmingly in favor. They saw him as the guarantor of the revolution's gains and the architect of national stability. Yet for some, this was not enough. A small group of royalists, supporters of the exiled Bourbon monarchy, began to plot his assassination. They believed that if Napoleon were removed, the old king could return. In 1803, a conspiracy was uncovered. The plotters had hoped to capture or kill Napoleon during one of his journeys. The police, loyal to the first consul, and arrested the ringleaders. But Napoleon decided to make an example. He ordered the arrest of the Duke of Enghien, a young Bourbon prince living across the border in the neutral state of Baden. The Duke was seized in a nighttime raid and brought to France. After a brief military tribunal, he was found guilty of conspiring against the state and was executed by firing squad in the moat of the Château de Vincennes. The act was controversial. Some called it a judicial murder. But Napoleon saw it as a necessary message. The monarchy would not return, and he would crush any attempt to restore it. The execution silenced the royalist plotters, but it also alarmed the other monarchies of Europe. They saw that Napoleon would stop at nothing to secure his position. In 1804, the final step was taken. A new constitution declared that Napoleon Bonaparte was Emperor of the French, a title that would be hereditary in his family. Another plebiscite confirmed the decision by an overwhelming majority. The Republic was now formally dead, even if the word Republic remained in the official language. The coronation ceremony was set for December 2nd, 1804, at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. It was an event designed to rival the crowning of Charlemagne himself. Pope Pius VII was brought from Rome to perform the ceremony. The Pope expected to place the crown on Napoleon's head, as was tradition. But Napoleon had other plans. As the Pope prepared the crown, Napoleon took it from his hands and placed it on his own head. Then he crowned his wife Josephine as Empress. The symbolism was unmistakable. Napoleon owed his power to no one but himself. The church was not the source of his authority. The people, through their vote, had given him the right to rule, and he would accept no earthly superior. The coronation was a masterpiece of theater. The cathedral was draped in velvet and gold. The music soared. The nobles of the new empire, many of them recently created marshals and senators, knelt before the emperor. Napoleon had also begun to create a new nobility, though he insisted it was not a return to the old feudal system. He awarded titles like Duke, Count, and Baron to his generals, administrators, and even some bankers. These titles came with estates and pensions, but they were not hereditary unless the holder had performed great service to the state. It was a way to bind the elite to his regime, it rewarding talent and loyalty rather than birth. The empire that emerged from these events looked like a monarchy. There was an emperor, a court, a nobility, and a hereditary succession, but it retained the language and some institutions of the revolution. The Napoleonic Code remained in force. The prefects still governed the departments. The lycées still trained the young. Napoleon called his rule a popular monarchy, a government that derived its power from the people yet concentrated all authority in one man. France had traded the chaos of revolution for the order of a single will. The question that now faced Europe was whether this new empire would stop at the borders of France, or whether the emperor's ambition would push further. The peace of 1802 had already crumbled. By the time of the coronation, Britain was again at war with France. The stage was set for the great conflict that would define the next decade of Napoleon's rule. What made this new empire's army so different from every other force on the continent? The answer lay not in better weapons or larger numbers, but in a structure that reinvented how an army moved, fought, and thought. Napoleon called it the Grande Armée, and it became the instrument that carried his ambitions across Europe. At its heart was the corps system. Each corps was a miniature army in itself, containing infantry divisions, cavalry brigades, and a battery of artillery, all under the command of a single general. This was not just a matter of organization. It was a philosophical shift. Instead of moving as one giant mass that clogged roads and starved the countryside, the Grand Armée could spread out across multiple routes, living off the land and advancing with breathtaking speed. A corps could fight alone for a day or two, holding an enemy in place, while the other corps converged on the battlefield like fingers closing into a fist. The enemy never knew where the main blow would fall. This marching divided, fighting united principle became Napoleon's signature. His soldiers covered distances that other armies thought impossible. They carried their own food for only a few days, relying on foraging and local supplies, which freed them from the slow wagons that dragged down traditional forces. A typical army of the time might manage 12 miles a day. Napoleon's men could push 25 or even 30, arriving at the decisive point before their opponents even realized they had been outflanked. The emphasis on speed was not a luxury, it was a weapon. To coordinate this complex dance, Napoleon relied on a command system built from merit, not birth. In the old royal army, promotion came from noble blood and family connections. A general's rank depended on who you knew rather than what you could do. Napoleon swept that away. He promoted officers based on proven talent, courage, and results. His marshals, the highest rank in the army, came from backgrounds as varied as the ranks themselves. Michel Ney started as a private. Joachim Murat was the son of an innkeeper. Louis-Nicolas Davout came from a minor, noble family, but earned his position through relentless competence. These men were not just loyal, they were capable, and they knew that their future depended on winning. The result was a culture of fierce ambition and personal devotion to the emperor. Alongside this meritocratic officer corps stood the Imperial Guard, an elite force that served as Napoleon's personal reserve. The Guard was not a single unit, but a collection of the best soldiers in the army, chosen for their height, their experience, and their conduct. They received higher pay, better rations, and the finest equipment. They marched at the head of parades and stood closest to the emperor in battle. But they were not just a ceremonial ornament. In moments of crisis, Napoleon held them back, waiting for the precise instant when their intervention would shatter the enemy. The mere presence of the Guard on the field could shift the momentum of a battle. Enemy commanders knew that if the Guard advanced, the Emperor was committing his final, unstoppable hammer. The tactical combination of these elements reached its peak at the Battle of Austerlitz in December of 1805. Napoleon faced a combined force of Russian and Austrian troops that outnumbered him. He deliberately weakened his right flank, making it look vulnerable, a trap baited with his own soldiers. The Allies took the bait. They moved their main force to crush that flank, exposing their center in the process. As they committed to the attack, Napoleon launched his main assault against the weakened center of the Allied line. French infantry advanced in columns, supported by artillery that had been massed on a low ridge. The cavalry waited in the folds of the ground, ready to exploit any gap. When the Allied center cracked, the French poured through. The Imperial Guard did not need to advance. The trap had worked perfectly. The Allied army was cut in two, with one half driven onto a frozen lake where artillery fire shattered the ice. Thousands surrendered. Austerlitz was not just a victory. It was a demonstration of everything the Grande Armée represented: speed to reach the decisive point, flexibility to adjust mid-battle, combined arms to break any defensive line, and the psychological edge that came from soldiers who trusted their commander and their system. The army that conquered Europe was not a faceless mass. It was a living machine of ambition, discipline, and innovation. Every soldier knew his place in the plan. Every officer knew that his next promotion depended on his performance. And every enemy commander knew that facing the Grande Armée meant facing not just superior numbers, but a way of war that the Old World could not match. The legacy of this force would echo through military thinking for generations, but its immediate purpose was to make Napoleon's empire unstoppable. The question that remained was whether any force on Earth could stop it, or whether the emperor himself would eventually push too far. The Third Coalition formed in 1805 with one clear goal: to crush the new emperor of the French. Britain had never made peace, and now Austria and Russia joined forces, determined to end Napoleon's rise before he could consolidate his power. They assembled massive armies, confident that together they could overwhelm the upstart from Corsica. But Napoleon did not wait to be attacked. He struck first, and he struck with a speed that left his enemies reeling. In late summer, he turned his Grande Armée away from the Channel coast, where it had been preparing for an invasion of England, and marched it eastward. The target was the Austrian army under General Karl Mack, which had already advanced into Bavaria, expecting to be reinforced by the slow-moving Russians. Napoleon saw a chance to destroy them before the Allies could join. His soldiers covered 300 miles in just over 3 weeks, living off the land and moving in separate corps that converged like the fingers of a closing fist. Mack waited at the fortress of Ulm, believing he had time to prepare. He was wrong. By the time he realized the French were upon him, his army was surrounded. On October 20th, 1805, Mack surrendered with over 20,000 men. A whole Austrian army had been captured without a major battle. The road to Vienna lay open. Napoleon entered the Austrian capital in November, but the war was not over. The Russian army under Tsar Alexander I had finally arrived, and the remnants of the Austrian forces joined them. The combined Russo-Austrian army retreated eastward, drawing Napoleon deeper into Moravia. They chose their ground carefully near the village of Austerlitz. What followed on December 2nd, the first anniversary of Napoleon's coronation, became his masterpiece. The Allied commanders, Tsar Alexander and the Austrian general Franz von Weirother, were young and eager for glory. Napoleon gave them exactly what they wanted. He deliberately weakened his right flank, pulling troops away from that sector and making it appear that his army was vulnerable. He even ordered his soldiers to create the illusion of confusion, moving about as if in panic. The Allies took the bait. They committed their main force to attacking that weakened flank, swinging down from the Pratzen Heights, a low ridge that dominated the battlefield. That was the mistake. Napoleon had concealed a massive corps behind a screen of hills, and the moment the Allies abandoned the heights, he unleashed his attack. French infantry stormed up the slopes of the Pratzen Heights, striking the Allied center at its most vulnerable point. The fighting was fierce, but the French veterans, hardened by years of campaign, broke through. The Allied army split in two. One half was pinned against a frozen lake where French artillery smashed the ice, sending thousands into the freezing water. The other half was driven from the field in disorder. By the end of the day, the Russo-Austrian army had lost over a quarter of its strength. Tsar Alexander fled the battlefield, and the Austrian Emperor Francis II sued for peace. The Treaty of Pressburg, signed later that month, was harsh. Austria lost vast territories in Italy and Germany, and it agreed to pay a massive indemnity. But the most profound consequence was political. The Holy Roman Empire, a loose confederation of German states that had existed for over 1,000 years, was effectively destroyed. Francis II resigned his title as Holy Roman Emperor and became merely the Emperor of Austria. The ancient structure that had claimed to be the successor to the empires of Rome and Charlemagne was no more. In its place, Napoleon created the Confederation of the Rhine, a union of German states under his protection. The map of Europe had been redrawn in a single day. Napoleon stood at the pinnacle of his power. He had humiliated the two great continental powers, broken the oldest political institution in Europe, and made himself the master of Central Europe. The question that remained was whether any force could ever challenge his supremacy, or whether he had reached a point where his own ambition would become his greatest enemy. While Napoleon crushed armies on land, a different war raged at sea, and there he could not win. On October 21st, 1805, off the southwest coast of Spain near Cape Trafalgar, the British Royal Navy under Admiral Horatio Nelson met the combined fleets of France and Spain. That Nelson had been hunting the enemy for months, and now he had them cornered. He led his 27 ships against 33 enemy vessels, but he held a crucial advantage. His crews were better trained, his captains more experienced, and his tactics more daring. Instead of forming a traditional line of battle, Nelson ordered his ships to break into the enemy formation in two columns, striking directly at its heart. The result was chaos for the Franco-Spanish fleet. British broadsides tore into wooden hulls at close range. Within hours, 22 enemy ships were captured or destroyed. Not a single British vessel was lost. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Nelson himself was struck by a sniper's bullet and died as the battle ended. His passing became a legend, a moment of sacrifice that cemented the Royal Navy's spirit for generations. For Napoleon, the defeat at Trafalgar was a strategic catastrophe. He had lost the only fleet capable of challenging British control of the seas. From that day forward, no French navy could safely leave port. Britain became an unbreakable shield, able to transport troops anywhere, blockade French harbors, and strike at Napoleon's empire from any coastline. He could never invade England, not as long as the Royal Navy patrolled the Channel. So he had to find another way to bring Britain to its knees. He turned to economic warfare, a plan called the Continental System. The idea was simple: close every European port to British trade, starve the island of markets and goods, and force its economy to collapse. But to enforce that system, Napoleon needed to control the entire continent. Trafalgar ensured that Britain's mastery of the waves would last for the rest of the Napoleonic Wars, a silent, constant pressure that slowly drained the resources of the empire. Every attempt Napoleon made to break that grip, from the continental system to later naval campaigns, failed in the face of British sea power. The ocean became a frontier he could never cross, and that failure would eventually help bring his empire down. He turned to a different kind of weapon: economic pressure. In November of 1806, from the conquered city of Berlin, Napoleon issued a decree that would reshape the entire continent. The Berlin Decree declared a total blockade of the British Isles. No ship coming from Britain or its colonies was allowed to enter any French-controlled port. All commerce, all trade, all letters and packages from those islands were forbidden. Any neutral vessel that had so much as touched a British port could be seized. The logic behind this policy was cold and strategic. Napoleon believed that Britain's wealth rested entirely on its exports of manufactured goods and its control of global trade routes. If he could cut off every market in Europe, the British economy would collapse. Factories would close, merchants would go bankrupt, and the people would demand peace. The British government would be forced to negotiate on his terms. It was an elegant theory, but it faced a brutal reality. Europe was not a sealed box. The coastline from the Baltic Sea to the Adriatic stretched for thousands of miles, dotted with small ports, hidden coves, and routes that smugglers had used for centuries. To enforce the blockade, Napoleon needed to control every harbor from Hamburg to Naples. And even then, the British found ways through. They bribed customs officials, they forged documents, they landed goods on remote beaches under cover of darkness. The continental system turned every fisherman and every harbor master into a potential criminal. Worse, the system hurt the very allies and neutral states that Napoleon depended on. Russia relied heavily on selling timber, hemp, and grain to Britain in exchange for manufactured goods. When Napoleon demanded that Tsar Alexander enforce the blockade, he was asking Russia to cut off its own economic lifeline. The Russian nobility, who owned the estates that produced these exports, grew furious. The same was true in Prussia and the smaller German states. Their merchants saw their livelihoods destroyed, while French officials looked the other way when smuggling occurred. The resentment simmered beneath the surface, a slow poison that eroded the loyalty of Napoleon's own allies. Perhaps the most damaging consequence unfolded on the Iberian Peninsula. Portugal, a longtime ally of Britain, refused to join the continental system. Napoleon decided to force the issue. In 1807, he sent an army through Spain to invade Portugal, a move that also allowed him to place his own brother Joseph on the Spanish throne. That decision ignited a brutal and prolonged conflict known as the Peninsular War, a war that drained French resources and exposed the limits of Napoleon's power. The Spanish people, furious at the overthrow of their king, rose in guerrilla warfare that no pitched battle could crush. British troops under the future Duke of Wellington landed in Portugal and supported the Spanish resistance. The fighting in the mountains and plains of Spain became a running sore that never healed. The continental system, designed to bring Britain to its knees, instead stretched Napoleon's empire to its breaking point. Yet he clung to the system, convinced that perseverance would eventually starve the island nation into submission. He tightened the screws with further decrees, even prohibiting the import of coffee, sugar, and cotton unless they came through French channels. But the British responded with their own orders in council, blockading French ports in return and threatening any neutral ship that traded with France. The result was a web of restrictions that strangled commerce across the entire continent. The very system that was supposed to secure Napoleon's supremacy became a source of weakness, driving a wedge between him and his allies, and preparing the ground for the catastrophic campaign that would finally shatter his empire. The continental system had already begun to crack when Napoleon turned his attention to the Iberian Peninsula in 1807. Portugal, a small kingdom on the Atlantic edge of Europe, stubbornly refused to close its ports to British ships. For years, it had been a quiet doorway through which British goods flowed into the continent, undermining the entire blockade. Napoleon decided that the door had to be sealed. He ordered an army under General Jean Andoche Junot to march across Spain and seize Lisbon. The Spanish government, nominally an ally, allowed the French troops to pass through its territory. But Napoleon had a larger plan than simply disciplining Portugal. He saw the Spanish monarchy as weak and divided, ripe for replacement. In March of 1808, he orchestrated a coup that forced the Spanish king Charles IV to abdicate and placed his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the throne. The Spanish people, however, did not accept this foreign ruler. They saw the French as invaders who had stolen their king and insulted their pride. On May 2nd of that same year, the streets of Madrid erupted in fury. Citizens attacked French soldiers with knives, rocks, and whatever they could grab. The French commander, Marshal Joachim Murat, responded with overwhelming force in ordering cavalry charges and volleys of musket fire into the crowd. Hundreds of Spaniards died in the clashes, and the uprising was crushed within hours. But the damage was done. News of the massacre spread across the country like wildfire, igniting a flame of resistance that would burn for 6 long years. The Spanish uprising was not a conventional war. There were no grand armies meeting on open plains. Instead, bands of peasants and townspeople, often led by local priests or former officers, launched surprise attacks on French supply columns, ambushed patrols in mountain passes, and then melted back into the countryside. This was guerrilla warfare, a term that entered the European vocabulary from this very conflict. The Spanish word guerrilla means little war, and it was exactly that. 1,000 small wounds that the French army could not heal. The terrain itself became an enemy. Spain is a land of rugged mountains, deep river gorges, and vast, empty plains. The French army was designed for rapid movement and decisive battles, but in Spain, it found itself chasing ghosts. An army of 20,000 men could march through a region, but the moment it left, the guerrillas returned, cutting telegraph lines, burning supply depots, and murdering isolated soldiers. The French response was brutal. They executed captured guerrillas, burned villages suspected of harboring them, and took hostages. But each act of repression only fueled more resistance. The war became a cycle of violence that no amount of military force could break. Then came the first major conventional defeat of Napoleon's imperial army. In July of 1808, a French corps of over 20,000 men under General Pierre Dupont marched deep into southern Spain, hoping to crush the rebellion in Andalusia. But they moved too far from support, and a Spanish army under General Francisco Castaños trapped them near the town of Bailén. The French found themselves surrounded on all sides, low on supplies, and facing a disciplined enemy. After a series of fierce engagements, Dupont surrendered his entire corps. It was the first time a Napoleonic army had capitulated on the open field. The news sent shockwaves through Europe. If the Spanish could defeat a French general in battle, then the emperor was not invincible. The British, who had been watching from the sea, seized the opportunity. In August of that same year, in a British expeditionary force under Sir Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, landed in Portugal. Wellesley was a cautious, methodical commander who understood the limits of his power. He knew he could not defeat the French in a single great battle. Instead, he used the rugged Portuguese countryside, the loyal support of the local population, and the protection of the British Navy to build a defensive line near Lisbon called the Lines of Torres Vedras. When the French attacked, they found themselves blocked by a network of forts, trenches, and flooded valleys. Behind those lines, Wellesley's army could rest, resupply, and strike again when the enemy grew weak. The Peninsular War became a steady drain on Napoleon's resources. He called it the Spanish ulcer, a wound that would not heal. Over 300,000 French soldiers were tied down in the peninsula, men who could have been used elsewhere. The campaign consumed enormous sums of money, strained the loyalty of French generals, and eroded the morale of the entire army. Soldiers dreaded being sent to Spain, where the enemy was invisible, the heat was unbearable, and the pay was always late. The British, meanwhile, grew stronger. Wellesley slowly pushed the French back, winning a series of battles at Talavera, Salamanca, and Vitoria. By the time Napoleon was forced to turn his attention to the east, the Spanish ulcer had already weakened his empire to the breaking point. The limits of Napoleonic power had been revealed. He could defeat any conventional army in Europe, but he could not conquer a people who refused to accept his rule. While the Spanish ulcer bled the empire dry, a new threat gathered in the east. Austria, humiliated after Austerlitz, but still nursing its pride, saw its chance. The French army was bogged down in the peninsula. The emperor was far away. In April of 1809, the Austrian Emperor Francis II declared war once more, hoping to restore his lost territories and break the Napoleonic system. This was the Fifth Coalition, and it seemed to catch the French off guard. But not for long. Napoleon rushed from Paris to the Danube Valley, gathering his forces as he traveled. The Austrian army, commanded by Archduke Charles, had learned from past defeats. It was better trained, better led, and fought with a stubbornness that surprised the French. The campaign that followed was unlike the swift triumphs of earlier years. At Aspern-Essling in May, Napoleon tried to cross the Danube near Vienna, but the Austrians struck before his army was fully assembled. The fighting raged for 2 days, street by street, house by house. Both sides suffered terrible losses. For the first time on land, Napoleon was forced to retreat. The French pulled back to an island in the river, licking their wounds. The news sent a shock across Europe. The emperor could be beaten. But Napoleon refused to accept defeat. He spent the next 6 weeks building a massive new bridge, ferrying supplies, and reinforcing his army. By early July, he was ready to try again. The second attempt led to the Battle of Wagram, fought near the flat, open fields north of Vienna. The Austrian army was dug in along a low ridge, their artillery positioned to sweep the approaches. Napoleon launched a series of attacks, but each one was thrown back. The cannon fire was so intense that the ground shook for miles. Then, in the afternoon, he ordered a massive cavalry charge, thousands of horsemen sweeping across the plain in a desperate gamble. The charge broke through an Austrian gap, but the cost was staggering. By nightfall, both armies were exhausted, and neither had won a clear victory. The next morning, the Austrians withdrew in good order. Wagram was a victory, but it was not a masterpiece. It was a grinding, bloody slog that left the French army battered and diminished. The peace that followed was harsh, but not crushing. Austria lost more territory, including the Adriatic coastline and parts of Galicia. It paid a heavy indemnity. But the real symbol of the settlement came with the marriage. Napoleon, now 39 years old, had no heir. His wife Josephine, though beloved, could not give him a child. He needed a son to secure his dynasty, and he needed a connection to the old royal families of Europe. So he divorced Josephine, a painful and controversial decision, and he asked for the hand of Archduchess Marie-Louise, the 18-year-old daughter of the very emperor he had just defeated. Francis II agreed. For Austria, it was a way to buy peace and gain influence. For Napoleon, it was a triumph of dynastic ambition. He had married into the ancient house of Habsburg, the family that had ruled the Holy Roman Empire for centuries. The revolutionary general had become a son-in-law of the old order. Yeah, the wedding was celebrated in Vienna by proxy in March of 1810, and then in Paris with immense pomp. The marriage was not a love match, but it served its purpose. In March of 1811, Marie-Louise gave birth to a son, a healthy boy whom Napoleon named François-Joseph Charles, but called the King of Rome. The title was deliberate. It echoed the legacy of the Holy Roman Empire, and it announced that the Napoleonic dynasty was here to stay. The birth was celebrated across the empire with fireworks, bells, and public holidays. Napoleon had his heir. He had his alliance with Austria. He seemed to stand at the summit of his power. Yet this peak was built on a fragile illusion. The marriage to Marie-Louise alienated his old allies, especially Russia. While Tsar Alexander I had once considered marrying one of his own sisters to Napoleon, but the emperor had chosen an Austrian princess instead. The slight deepened the growing rift between Paris and St. Petersburg. More importantly, the marriage signaled that Napoleon had abandoned the revolutionary ideals that had once justified his rise. He was no longer the general of the people, the man who had promised liberty and equality. He was now a monarch who married into the oldest aristocracy in Europe, who founded a new nobility, who sought legitimacy from the very system he had once overthrown. The revolution was over. In its place stood an empire that looked more and more like the old world it had replaced. The peace with Austria bought time, but it did not bring stability. The continent was uneasy, and far to the east, a vast empire was already preparing for war. That empire was Russia, and by 1812, the tension had become unbearable. Tsar Alexander I had grown tired of the continental system. His economy depended on trade with Britain, and the blockade was strangling his merchants and landowners. He began to allow British ships into Russian ports, openly defying Napoleon's decrees. The emperor in Paris saw this as a betrayal that could unravel his entire strategy for defeating Britain. If Russia could break the blockade with impunity, then Prussia, Sweden, and the smaller German states would soon follow. The grand plan of economic war would collapse, and Britain would remain unshaken. Worse, Napoleon feared that Alexander was secretly preparing to join a new coalition, a sixth alliance that would bring together Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Britain. He decided to strike first and destroy the threat before it could take shape. The army he assembled for this purpose was the largest Europe had ever seen. Over 600,000 men, drawn from every corner of the empire, crossed the Niemen River into Russian territory in June of 1812. They came from France, Italy, Poland, the German states, even from Switzerland and Croatia. It was a polyglot force, speaking dozens of languages, united only by the emperor's will. The logistics alone were staggering. Tens of thousands of horses pulled supply wagons, artillery caissons, and ambulances. The columns stretched for miles, a river of men and metal flowing eastward into the unknown. But the Russian army did not oblige Napoleon with a decisive battle. They retreated, drawing him deeper into the vast interior. It was scorching the earth as they went. Villages were burned, fields set alight, livestock driven away. The French soldiers found nothing to feed themselves or their horses. The supply system, already strained by the sheer size of the army, began to break down. Men started to fall ill from contaminated water and the lack of fresh food. The horses, starved and overworked, died by the hundreds. Every abandoned village promised shelter, but also brought dysentery and typhus. The emperor pushed on, certain that the Russians would have to turn and fight before they reached the holy city of Moscow. The first major clash came at Smolensk in August. The Russians defended the ancient city wall with determination, but after 2 days of bombardment, they slipped away under cover of darkness, setting the town on fire behind them. Napoleon entered the smoking ruins, finding nothing of value. Still, he pressed forward. The Russian commander, General Mikhail Kutuzov, finally decided to make a stand at Borodino, about 70 miles west of Moscow, on September 7th. The battle that followed was one of the bloodiest of the entire era. Over 250,000 men faced each other across a rolling plain of wheat fields and forests. The French attacked a series of earthwork fortifications called the Bagration Flèches, named after the Russian general who commanded that sector. The fighting was relentless. Wave after wave of infantry charged the redoubts only to be thrown back by artillery and countercharges. The casualties mounted on both sides, a slaughter that neither army could sustain for long. By the end of the day, the Russians had been pushed back, but not broken. They withdrew in good order, leaving the field to the French. Napoleon had lost over 30,000 men, including 47 generals. The Russian losses were even higher, perhaps 50,000. But Kutuzov had preserved his army, and that was what mattered. Borodino was not the decisive victory Napoleon needed. It was a brutal, costly stalemate that left his forces severely weakened. Still, he advanced. A week later, on September 14th, the Grande Armée marched into Moscow. They expected to find a city that would serve as a bargaining chip, a symbol of conquest that would force Alexander to sue for peace. Instead, they found a ghost town. Most of the population had fled, and that night, fires broke out across the city, set by Russian patriots or perhaps by the retreating governor. The flames raged for days, consuming wooden houses, food stores, and the grand palaces of the old nobility. When the fires finally died, Moscow was a blackened ruin. Napoleon waited in the Kremlin, hoping for a message from the Tsar. He waited for 5 weeks. No message came. Alexander refused to negotiate. The emperor faced an impossible choice. His army was too depleted to continue eastward, and winter was approaching. He could not stay in the ruined city, and to retreat now would be to admit defeat. On October 19th, he gave the order to march back the way they had come. The retreat from Moscow began. What had been a long, difficult campaign now turned into a catastrophe. The winter came early and with a fury that the French soldiers had never experienced. Temperatures dropped to 30 degrees below zero. The men, dressed in summer uniforms and thin boots, froze to death on the march. The horses that had survived the campaign died in droves, reducing mobility and leaving artillery and wagons stranded. Food was almost impossible to find. The soldiers resorted to eating horseflesh, sometimes raw, and even boiled leather from their equipment. Discipline disintegrated. The column stretched for over 50 miles as the weakest fell behind. Cossack cavalry, swift and ruthless, harried the flanks, cutting down stragglers and raiding the supply wagons that remained. The Russian army, now reinforced and well supplied, pressed the retreating French at every point. At the crossing of the Berezina River in late November, the situation became desperate. The bridge had been destroyed, and the Russians were closing in. Engineers worked in the freezing water to construct temporary bridges while the army fought a rearguard action. Thousands died in the chaos, trampled, drowned, or captured. Those who made it across faced more miles of snow and ice. By the time the remnants of the Grande Armée staggered out of Russia in December, fewer than 50,000 men remained of the original 600,000. The emperor himself had abandoned the army in early December, leaving command to his marshals and racing back to Paris to salvage his throne. The invasion of Russia had destroyed not just an army, but the myth of Napoleon's invincibility. The grand project of empire, built on victory after victory, now rested on a shattered foundation. The news of the Russian disaster spread across Europe like a shockwave. For the first time, Napoleon had lost not just a battle, but an entire army, and his enemies sensed that the moment of reckoning had arrived. Prussia, still nursing the wounds of Jena and the humiliating Peace of Tilsit, was the first to act. In February of 1813, King Frederick William III joined forces with Tsar Alexander, signing the Treaty of Kalisz that formally revived the alliance against France. Sweden, under the former French Marshal Bernadotte, who had switched sides, added its weight to the coalition. Austria hesitated, remembering its own defeats in the marriage alliance, but by August, it too joined the Sixth Coalition, seeing a chance to reclaim lost influence. Britain, as always, provided money and naval support, while the Spanish ulcer continued to drain French resources. Napoleon scrambled to rebuild his army. He conscripted teenagers and called up veterans from the Spanish front, but these raw recruits lacked the experience and morale of the old Grande Armée. Still, he moved with his characteristic speed into Germany, winning victories at Lutzen and Bautzen in May of 1813. The coalition forces retreated, but they were not broken. An armistice in the summer gave both sides time to prepare, and when fighting resumed in August, the enemy was larger, better coordinated, and more determined than ever. The decisive moment came in October near the city of Leipzig, a name that would forever echo in the history of the empire. Over 500,000 men converged on the surrounding plains, making it the largest battle Europe had ever seen. Napoleon held the center with about 200,000 troops, but the coalition had nearly 350,000, and they approached from three directions. The fighting raged for 3 days, from October 16th to the 19th, across villages and fields choked with smoke and the roar of artillery. Napoleon's tactics were as brilliant as ever, but his army was simply too small and too inexperienced to hold against such numbers. He launched a desperate cavalry charge on the second day that punched a hole in the Allied lines, but there were not enough reserves to exploit the gap. The coalition commanders, for once, did not panic. They rotated fresh troops into the fight, while the French units grew exhausted. On the third day, catastrophe struck. The Saxon contingent, German soldiers fighting under French command, suddenly turned their guns on their own allies and defected to the coalition. Entire regiments switched sides in the middle of the battle, creating a gap that could not be filled. The French line began to crumble. Napoleon ordered a retreat, but the only escape route was a single bridge over the White Elster River. In the chaos, a nervous engineer detonated the bridge too early, trapping over 30,000 French soldiers on the wrong side. They were captured or killed as the coalition closed in. The emperor himself barely escaped with the remnants of his army. The Battle of the Nations, as Leipzig came to be called, shattered Napoleon's hold on Germany. He retreated across the Rhine into France, his empire reduced to its pre-revolutionary borders. The coalition pressed forward, invading French territory in early 1814. Napoleon fought a brilliant defensive campaign, winning several small victories against larger forces, but he could not be everywhere at once. In March, the coalition armies marched directly on Paris. The city, weary of war and lacking faith in the emperor's fortunes, surrendered without a fight. The marshals, seeing the end, urged Napoleon to abdicate. On April 6, 1814, he signed the Act of Abdication at Fontainebleau. The empire that had stretched from the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow was reduced to a memory, and its creator was exiled to the small island of Elba, a final humiliation for a man who had once made the world tremble. But even then, the story was not over. The coalition armies closed in on Paris in the final days of March 1814. Tsar Alexander I of Russia and King Frederick William III of Prussia led their troops toward the capital, while Napoleon himself was still trying to rally his scattered forces to the east, near Fontainebleau. He had fought a brilliant defensive campaign, winning small victories at Champaubert and Montmirail, but he could not be everywhere at once. The coalition knew this, and they drove straight for the political heart of the empire. The streets of Paris saw little resistance. The city was defended by a thin line of National Guardsmen and a few regular troops under Marshals Marmont and Mortier. They fought bravely on the outskirts, but the sheer weight of the enemy numbers forced them back. On the morning of March 31st, the Allied sovereigns entered Paris in triumph. The citizens watched in silence, many still loyal to the emperor, but exhausted by years of war and blockade. The coalition quickly set up a provisional government, led by the former foreign minister Talleyrand, a man who had already decided that Napoleon's time was over. Meanwhile, at Fontainebleau, Napoleon learned that Paris had fallen. He still had an army of about 60,000 men, and his marshals urged him to march immediately to retake the capital. He agreed, but then the news arrived that his own generals were turning against him. Marshal Marmont, who had been left to hold the southern approaches, made a secret agreement with the coalition. On April 4th, he led his entire corps of 10,000 men out of line and surrendered them to the enemy. The betrayal was a hammer blow. Napoleon realized that without the support of his senior commanders, any attack on Paris would fail. He gathered his marshals in the study of the Palace of Fontainebleau. They told him bluntly that the army would not fight for him any longer, that the empire was lost. On April 6, 1814, he signed the Act of Abdication. The document declared that he renounced the throne of France and of Italy for himself and for his heirs. It was a bitter end to a reign that had once stretched from Madrid to Warsaw, from Hamburg to Rome. The terms of his exile were laid out in the Treaty of Fontainebleau, signed on April 11th. He was granted full sovereignty over the tiny island of Elba, located in the Mediterranean between Corsica and Italy. He could keep a personal guard of 400 men, and he would receive an annual pension of 2 million francs from the French government, a promise that would soon be broken. The treaty also allowed his wife, Marie-Louise, and his son to join him, but they never did. Marie-Louise returned to Austria, taking the young king of Rome with her, and the boy would never see his father again. The farewell scene at Fontainebleau became a legend. On April 20th, Napoleon assembled the remains of the old guard in the palace courtyard. These were the soldiers who had followed him from Italy to Egypt, from Austerlitz to Moscow. They stood in perfect rows, many weeping openly. Napoleon walked down the line, speaking to the veterans as equals. He told them that he could have died fighting, but he chose to live for the good of France. He embraced the eagle of the regiment and kissed the flag. Then he said farewell. The soldiers wept. They watched as their emperor climbed into a carriage and drove away toward the coast. He left for Elba on a British ship, the Undaunted, arriving on May 4th. The island was small, roughly 150 square miles, with a population of about 12,000. It had a single town, Portoferraio, where Napoleon set up a miniature court. He oversaw public works, built roads, improved the harbor, and even planted olive groves. He wore a plain green coat and spent his days in quiet activity. But he was watching the news from the continent with an intensity that belied his calm exterior. Meanwhile, back in Paris, the Bourbon monarchy was restored. The brother of Louis XVI, the king who had been executed during the Revolution, returned from exile as King Louis XVIII. He issued a charter that preserved many of the reforms of the Revolution and the Empire, including the Napoleonic Code. But he also brought back the old noble titles and the symbolism of the monarchy. Many French people welcomed peace after 20 years of war. But many others, especially the army veterans, the small farmers who had gained land from the Revolution, and the administrators who had served the empire, felt uneasy. They feared the return of the old aristocracy and suspected that their gains would be taken away. Across Europe, the leaders of the coalition gathered in Vienna in September of 1814 for a grand congress to redraw the map of the continent. The Congress of Vienna was a celebration of victory, a gathering of emperors, kings, diplomats, and aristocrats. They danced at balls and feasted at banquets, but behind the glittering surfaces, they argued for months over territory, influence, and how to prevent another France from rising. Tsar Alexander wanted to create a new order based on Christian brotherhood. The Austrian Chancellor Metternich wanted to restore the old balance of power. The British representative Castlereagh wanted to ensure that no single power could dominate Europe again. The former French Foreign Minister Talleyrand, now representing the restored Bourbon king, managed to keep France at the table as an equal, a diplomatic masterstroke. The terms of the final settlement were harsh, but not crushing. France was reduced to its borders of 1792. It had to pay an indemnity of 700 million francs and support an occupying army for 5 years. But it remained a major power, and the Bourbon monarchy was recognized. The Congress also redrew the map of Germany, creating a new confederation of 39 states under Austrian presidency. It gave the Netherlands to the House of Orange, and it placed much of northern Italy under Austrian control. The old order seemed restored. The revolution was over. Napoleon was on a tiny island, a footnote to history. But the peacemakers had underestimated one thing: the man on Elba was not done. On February 26, 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte slipped away from Elba. He had been watching the news from Europe with growing restlessness. The restored Bourbon monarchy under King Louis XVIII was already making mistakes, alienating the army and the peasants who had benefited from the revolution. The allies at the Congress of Vienna were squabbling among themselves, unable to agree on the final shape of the new Europe. And most importantly, the French people were beginning to whisper that the emperor, even in defeat, had been a better ruler than the king who had returned in the baggage train of the foreign armies. The moment was ripe for a gamble. Under cover of darkness, Napoleon boarded a small brig named the Inconstant, accompanied by just over 1,000 men from his personal guard. They slipped past the British patrol ships that watched the island, a feat of seamanship and luck that still surprises historians. After a voyage of 3 days, they landed on the southern coast of France at Golfe Juan, near the town of Antibes. It was March 1st, and Napoleon stepped onto French soil with nothing but a handful of loyal soldiers and a daring plan. He did not march on Paris with his small force. Instead, he headed north through the mountainous region of the Alps, taking the route known as the Route Napoleon. He knew that the key to success was not military force, but the power of his name. He sent ahead proclamations, declaring that he came to restore the rights of the people and to defend the nation against the tyranny of the Bourbons. He promised peace with the Allied powers, though he knew that promise would be tested. The first test came at the town of Grenoble. The royal troops sent to stop him were drawn up on the road, their cannons aimed at the approaching column. Napoleon stepped forward alone, unarmed, and opened his coat. He called out to the soldiers, telling them that if any wished to kill their emperor, here he was. For a long moment, no one moved. Then a cry went up, "Vive l'Empereur!" The royal regiment tore the white Bourbon cockade from their hats and joined his ranks. The news spread like wildfire. At Lyon, the second city of France, the garrison went over to him almost without a fight. King Louis XVIII sent Marshal Ney, one of Napoleon's most trusted commanders, to stop the advance. Ney had sworn allegiance to the Bourbons, but when he met the emperor's column, the old loyalty stirred. He embraced Napoleon and brought his entire army into the fold. The march to Paris became a triumphal procession. By the time Napoleon reached the outskirts of the capital on March 20th, the royal court had fled. Louis XVIII slipped away to Belgium, and the city opened its gates without a shot. The empire was reborn. But the situation was far from secure. The Allies at Vienna declared Napoleon an outlaw and renewed their oath to destroy him. They assembled massive armies on all sides, nearly 1 million men from Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, and the smaller German states. Napoleon knew he could not defeat such overwhelming numbers in a long war. His only hope was to strike quickly, to defeat the closest enemy armies before the others could arrive, and then to negotiate a peace from a position of strength. The first opponents to hand were the British and Prussian armies stationed in Belgium, under the Duke of Wellington and Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. Napoleon moved with his characteristic speed, gathering an army of around 120,000 men, many of them veterans who had returned to his colors. He also worked to rebuild the government, issuing a new, more liberal constitution called the Additional Act, which guaranteed civil liberties and a parliamentary system. He hoped this would reassure the French people and the European powers that he was no longer the absolute emperor of old. But the Allies were not interested in negotiations. They wanted a final, decisive end to the Napoleonic threat. By early June, Napoleon was ready. He marched his army into Belgium, aiming to drive a wedge between the British and Prussian forces before they could unite. The campaign that followed would unfold over just a few days, culminating in a battle that would decide the fate of Europe for a generation. The campaign in Belgium lasted only 100 days. By June of 1815, the 3 Allied armies threatened Napoleon from different directions. The nearest were the British and Dutch-Belgian forces under the Duke of Wellington, stationed near Brussels, and the Prussian army under Field Marshal Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, spread out along the Sambre River to the east. Further behind, a massive Austro-Russian force was slowly marching toward France, but it would take weeks to arrive. Napoleon knew he had to act before those reinforcements could join. He aimed to drive a wedge between Wellington and Blücher, defeat them separately, and then negotiate from a position of strength before the Austrians and Russians ever reached the battlefield. On June 15th, the French army crossed the border into Belgium, moving with the speed that had once stunned Europe. Napoleon divided his force into two wings, one under Marshal Ney to pin down Wellington at a crossroads called Quatre Bras, and the other under his own command to strike Blücher near the village of Ligny. The plan was simple in theory, but demanded flawless coordination. That coordination began to fray almost immediately. At Quatre Bras, Ney faced a stubborn defense by British and Dutch troops under the Prince of Orange. The fighting was brutal, with cavalry charges slamming into infantry squares and artillery tearing into both sides. Ney had the numbers to break through, but he hesitated, committing his forces piecemeal rather than delivering a single overwhelming blow. By the end of the day, both sides held their ground, but the French had failed to destroy Wellington's army. At Ligny, Napoleon fared better. He hammered the Prussian lines with artillery and launched a series of attacks that finally cracked the center late in the afternoon. Blücher himself was nearly captured when his horse was shot from under him and the Prussian army retreated in disorder. It was a victory, but not the crushing blow Napoleon needed. Blücher's army was battered, not shattered. And in the confusion, Napoleon lost track of the Prussians. He assumed they were retreating east toward their supply lines, away from Wellington. But Blücher had given his word to the Duke that he would march to his aid, and he directed his beaten army to fall back north, toward the town of Wavre, still within striking distance of Wellington's position. Napoleon sent a corps under Marshal Grouchy to pursue the Prussians, but the orders were vague, as Grouchy was told to follow the enemy, but not to engage in a major battle if they were too strong. The result was a slow, hesitant chase that left Grouchy's 30,000 men marching in circles, while the Prussians regrouped and turned their gaze toward Waterloo. On the morning of June 18th, Napoleon faced Wellington's army on a low ridge south of the village of Waterloo. The ground was a rolling plain of wheat fields and mud, soaked by heavy rain the night before. Wellington had chosen his position carefully. His troops were deployed behind the ridge, concealed from French artillery, with three key strongpoints: the farmhouse of Hougoumont on the right, the farmstead of La Haye-Sainte in the center, and the village of Papelotte on the left. These positions acted as anchors, forcing the French to capture each one before they could break the main line. Napoleon had about 72,000 men against Wellington's 68,000. He knew that if Blücher arrived, the odds would shift dramatically against him. But he believed Grouchy would hold the Prussians at bay, or that he could defeat Wellington before Blücher could intervene. The emperor delayed the start of the battle until late morning to let the muddy ground dry, a decision that cost him precious hours he could not recover. The opening blow was a diversionary attack on Hougoumont, a walled farmhouse defended by British guards and light infantry. The French launched wave after wave of infantry and cavalry, but the defenders held the gates, repelling every assault. The fighting around Hougoumont became a bloody stalemate, the drawing in more and more French reserves without breaking through. It was a trap that Wellington had set, and Napoleon walked into it. The main attack came in the early afternoon against the French left, aimed at La Haye-Sainte and the ridge behind it. French infantry columns advanced with flags flying and drums beating, but the British infantry, lying hidden behind the crest, rose at the last moment and delivered devastating volleys at close range. The column staggered, then fell back. A second assault by cavalry under Marshal Ney came later, but Ney misjudged the situation. He saw what he thought was a British withdrawal and ordered a mass charge of thousands of horsemen. They swept over the ridge, only to find the British infantry still standing in squares, bristling bayonets. The French cavalry crashed against those squares and could not break them. They were trapped in a killing zone, pounded by artillery from the flanks. Charge after charge ended the same way, leaving the field littered with horses and men. Meanwhile, on the far right of the French line, the sound of cannon fire grew louder. It was not French artillery, it was Prussian. Blücher had made good on his promise. His advance guard began arriving on the battlefield in the late afternoon, threatening Napoleon's flank and rear. The emperor was forced to detach part of his reserve to hold them back, thinning the force he could commit against Wellington. Inside the center, the farm of La Haye Sainte finally fell to the French after a determined assault. The defenders ran out of ammunition and had to abandon the position. For a brief moment, the road to Brussels lay open, but Napoleon had no fresh troops to exploit the gap. His reserves were occupied with the Prussians, and his cavalry was exhausted. The opportunity slipped away. By late evening, the situation was desperate. Wellington's line was still intact, though battered. The Prussian pressure on the French right was growing stronger. Napoleon made his final gamble. He ordered the Imperial Guard, the elite veterans of 100 battles, to advance straight at the British center. These were the soldiers who had never been known to retreat, the cream of the Grande Armée. They marched in perfect formation, 3 battalions strong, up the muddy slope toward the ridge. The British guards, lying hidden in the tall grass, waited until the French were within 30 yards. Then they rose and fired a volley that tore through the front ranks. The Imperial Guard hesitated. Then a second volley came, and then the British charged with bayonets. For the first time in history, the Imperial Guard broke and fell back, shouting in confusion. The cry spread through the French army, "La Garde recule," the Guard retreats. It was the signal of total collapse. The morale of the entire French army shattered. Soldiers threw down their weapons and fled. Wellington, seeing his moment, ordered a general advance. The Prussians, now fully engaged, swept into the French rear. The battlefield became a rout. Napoleon, surrounded by a small group of loyal officers, was forced to flee. His carriage was abandoned, his personal effects looted. The army that had once conquered Europe dissolved into a desperate stream of refugees. Napoleon reached Paris on June 21st. He tried to rally support for a continuation of the war, but the political will had evaporated. The chambers of Parliament demanded his abdication, and the Allies refused to negotiate. On June 22nd, he signed his second abdication, this time for good. He had reigned for exactly 100 days. The final chapter of the Napoleonic Empire closed with his surrender to the British on July 15th. He was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he would spend the last 6 years of his life in isolation, writing his memoirs and reflecting on the empire that had burned so brightly and vanished so quickly. The Battle of Waterloo ended not just a campaign, but an era, in a time when one man's ambition had reshaped the map of Europe and left a legacy that would echo through the centuries. Paris was a city of panic. The news of Waterloo arrived on June 21st, and within hours, the streets filled with rumors of betrayal and collapse. The emperor reached the capital late that evening, still hoping to rally the nation for a final stand. He called on the chambers of parliament to support him, but the deputies had lost faith. They demanded his abdication as the only way to negotiate with the advancing Allied armies. On June 22nd, just 4 days after the battle, Napoleon signed his second abdication at the Élysée Palace. This time, there was no army to call back. His marshals urged him to flee before the Prussians arrived, and he began to plan an escape to America. He hoped to cross the Atlantic and start a new life in the young republic, far from the reach of his enemies. A ship awaited him at the port of Rochefort on the western coast, but the British Navy had already sealed every harbor. For 2 weeks, he waited at the coastal town of Fouras, watching the horizon for a chance to slip through the blockade. It never came. The British frigates patrolled day and night, and the captain of the French frigate that could have carried him refused to risk an engagement. On July 15th, Napoleon made a decision that would define his final years. He wrote a letter to the Prince Regent of Britain, offering himself as a prisoner. He compared himself to Themistocles, the ancient Greek general who sought refuge with his enemy after defeat. He stepped onto the deck of the British ship HMS Bellerophon, commanded by Captain Frederick Maitland, and surrendered his sword. The British public was fascinated by his arrival. Crowds gathered at Plymouth to catch a glimpse of the fallen emperor. But the British government had no intention of allowing him to remain in Europe. They feared that any exile closer than the ends of the earth would become a focus for new conspiracies. After weeks of debate, they chose the most remote place in their empire, the island of St. Helena, a volcanic speck in the South Atlantic, over 1,000 miles from the nearest continent. Napoleon was transferred to the HMS Northumberland for the voyage, which took over 2 months. He spent the journey in a small cabin, reading, dictating his memoirs, and complaining about the poor food. The ship arrived at the island on October 15th, 1815. The governor of St. Helena was Sir Hudson Lowe, a rigid and suspicious man who followed his instructions to the letter. He imposed a strict regime on the emperor. Napoleon was confined to a damp, decaying house called Longwood, surrounded by a perimeter of sentries and a fence that he was not allowed to cross without an escort. The climate was humid and unhealthy, and the isolation began to wear on his spirit. He was allowed a small household of loyal followers, but they too were restricted. The British guards kept constant watch, reporting every word and gesture. Napoleon spent his days dictating his version of history, arguing with his attendants, and trying to find meaning in the slow passage of time. The legacy of the empire now rested not on further conquest, but on the story he would leave behind. And in that lonely captivity, on an island at the edge of the world, he began to write his own legend. The pen became his final weapon on that distant island. St. Helena measured only 10 miles wide and stretched across a volcanic landscape of jagged cliffs and constant wind. Longwood House, the damp wooden structure where he lived, offered little comfort. Rain leaked through the roof, mold spread across the walls, and the air carried a chill that never lifted. Sir Hudson Lowe, the British governor, enforced every restriction with rigid precision. The former emperor could not walk beyond a small perimeter without an armed escort. His mail was opened and read before it reached him. Visitors were scarce, and those who came were watched. The isolation was meant to break him, but instead it sharpened his focus. He began to dictate his memoirs to a small group of loyal followers, most notably Emmanuel de las Casas, a former nobleman who had returned to serve his fallen master. They worked for hours each day, sitting at a simple table while Napoleon paced the room and spoke. He did not simply remember events. He shaped them. He presented himself as a defender of the revolution, a man who had brought liberty to Europe only to be crushed by the old monarchies who feared the spread of reform. He cast his defeats as betrayals by others, by the weather, by the sheer weight of numbers arrayed against him. He never admitted that his own ambition had driven the empire too far. The memoirs were a work of art, a carefully crafted story that would outlive him and transform his image from a defeated ruler into a tragic hero. As the months passed and his health declined, he suffered from stomach pain, nausea, and a growing weakness that kept him in bed for days at a time. He complained of the cold and the damp, and he refused to take the medicines that the British doctors prescribed. His own physician, Francesco Antomarchi, noted the symptoms with concern. The debate over what caused his passing on May 5th, 1821, has never fully settled. Some historians point to a family history of stomach cancer, the same illness that had claimed his father. Others suggest exposure to arsenic, possibly from the green wallpaper in his room or from a long-term buildup in his system. The evidence remains inconclusive, and the question lingers as part of the mystery that surrounds his end. Whatever the cause, the moment itself was quiet. He died in his bed at Longwood, surrounded by a handful of attendants. His final words, according to some accounts, referred to France and his son. The body was embalmed and buried on the island, in a simple grave under a willow tree. But that was not the end. In 1840, the French government, now under King Louis-Philippe, negotiated with the British to return his remains to France. The coffin was exhumed and carried across the ocean on a frigate named La Belle Poule. When it arrived in Paris on a freezing December day, hundreds of thousands of people lined the streets. The hearse passed under the Arc de Triomphe, a monument that Napoleon himself had begun to build. His bones were placed in a grand sarcophagus of red quartzite at the Church of Les Invalides, where they rest to this day. The exile that was meant to erase him instead turned him into a romantic figure, a symbol of genius and ambition destroyed by fate. The memoirs he had dictated became a bestseller across Europe, and the image of the lonely emperor on a distant rock captured the hearts of a generation. The man who had tried to conquer the world had now conquered the imagination of the future. His body rests beneath a gilded dome, but his ideas still govern millions. The empire crumbled, the emperor died in exile, and the old monarchies thought they had erased his revolution. What they could not erase was the system he had built, a system that outlived him by generations and spread far beyond the borders of France. The most enduring piece of that system is the Napoleonic Code, the civil law that he first introduced in 1804. Before the code, Europe was a patchwork of local customs, Roman law, feudal privileges, and royal decrees that varied from province to province. A merchant traveling from Lyon to Milan could face entirely different rules in each city. The code swept all that away with a single, clear document. It established that all male citizens were equal before the law, that property rights were sacred, that contracts were binding, and that secular courts, not church tribunals, would settle disputes. It was not a perfect document. It placed women under the authority of their husbands and restored slavery in the French colonies. But for its time, it was a radical step toward legal uniformity and rationality. As Napoleon conquered Europe, he carried the code with him. It was imposed in Italy, the Netherlands, the German states, Poland, and Spain. Even after his defeat, the code remained in force in many of those places. It influenced the legal systems of Belgium, Luxembourg, and Switzerland. When Latin American countries won their independence from Spain and Portugal in the early 1800s, they looked to the Napoleonic Code as a model for their own civil codes. The legal DNA of the empire, the idea that law should be written, clear, and equal for all, became a foundation of modern civil law across continents. The second pillar of his legacy was the centralization of the French state. Before Napoleon, the French government had been weak and fragmented. Local nobles and provincial parliaments held real power. The revolution had tried to centralize authority, but had failed in the chaos of war. Napoleon succeeded where the revolution had failed. He divided France into departments, on each run by a prefect appointed directly from Paris. These prefects controlled taxation, police, public works, and education. They reported to the central government and carried out its orders without local interference. This system of administrative centralization became a model for modern states. It gave France a unified, efficient bureaucracy that could respond quickly to crises. It also gave the government a powerful tool for control, but it was a tool that later democratic governments would inherit and use for public services. The prefect system survives in France to this day, a quiet monument to Napoleonic efficiency. Alongside law and administration came the metric system. The revolution had introduced the meter and the kilogram as rational replacements for the confusing jumble of local units of measurement. But the old habits died hard, and the system was not widely adopted until Napoleon enforced it across his empire. He saw the metric system as a tool of unity, a way to make trade, science, and taxation consistent from one end of Europe to the other. Soldiers, merchants, and officials all had to use the new measures. After the empire fell, the metric system did not vanish. It spread through scientific circles and eventually became the global standard for measurement. The meter and the kilogram, born from the French Revolution and cemented by Napoleon's armies, now govern everything from international trade to the precision of medical dosages. Education was another battlefield where he left a lasting mark. The lycées he established, state-run secondary schools with a strict curriculum of mathematics, literature, and science, became the model for modern public education in France and beyond. He believed that education should produce loyal, capable citizens who could serve the state as administrators, officers, and engineers. The lycées were open to all boys who could pass the entrance exams, regardless of birth. This was a revolutionary idea. It created a pathway for talented youth from modest backgrounds to rise into the elite. The principle of meritocracy, that advancement should depend on ability, not ancestry, was woven into the fabric of Napoleon's institutions. It challenged the old aristocratic order and planted seeds of social mobility that would grow for generations. And yet, the most powerful legacy of the empire may not have been any single institution, but an idea that swept across Europe like wildfire: nationalism. Napoleon did not invent nationalism, but his conquests spread it. When French armies invaded Germany and Italy, they brought with them the revolutionary ideals of popular sovereignty and national unity. Local people saw that the old patchwork of tiny principalities and foreign rulers could be overthrown. They began to imagine themselves as Germans, as Italians, as Poles. The resistance to Napoleon, the guerrilla wars in Spain, the popular uprisings in Tyrol, the Prussian reforms, all of these were fueled by a new sense of national identity. The very forces that defeated Napoleon were shaped by the ideas he had unleashed. After his fall, the Congress of Vienna tried to turn back the clock. The statesmen who gathered in 1814 and 1815 wanted to restore the old order, and to impose a balance of power that would prevent any single nation from dominating Europe again. They redrew the map, merging small states into larger ones, creating the German Confederation, and strengthening the buffer kingdoms around France. But they could not erase the longing for national unity that Napoleon had ignited. Over the next century, that longing would redraw Europe again, leading to the unification of Italy and Germany, the collapse of the Austrian Empire, and the rise of the very nation states that define modern Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had tried to conquer the world, ended up shaping the world that conquered him. The legal codes, the centralized government, the metric system, the public schools, the very idea that a nation belongs to its people rather than to its king, all of these survived his downfall. They became the quiet infrastructure of modern life, so familiar that most people never stop to ask where they came from. Yet every time a citizen stands equal before a judge, every time a student passes an exam to enter a public school, every time a scientist measures a distance in meters, they are living in a world that Napoleon helped build. His empire lasted barely a decade and a half, but its shadow stretches across 2 centuries. And the story of that rise and fall, the drama of one man's ambition, and the world that rose to stop him, continues to fascinate because it asks a question that never grows old. How far can one individual reshape the course of history, and at what cost? The wars that Napoleon set in motion did not end when he left the stage. They fundamentally altered the way Europe understood conflict, nationhood, and the very nature of power itself. Before the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, armies were small, professional forces led by aristocratic officers who saw war as a limited game, a contest for territory and dynastic advantage, not a struggle between entire peoples. A typical army in the 1700s numbered perhaps 50,000 men, and battles were often decided by maneuvering rather than slaughter. The French Revolution changed that calculus when it introduced the levée en masse, the mass conscription of citizens to defend the nation. Napoleon inherited that concept and weaponized it on a continental scale. He turned the army into a school for the nation, a place where young men from every corner of France, and later from conquered lands, learned to fight under a single flag. The sheer scale of mobilization was unprecedented. At its peak, the Grande Armée drew in over 600,000 men from across the empire. This was not a mercenary force or a professional caste. It was a national army, bound by loyalty to an ideal and a leader. The idea that every citizen had a duty to fight for the state was a revolutionary concept. It spread across Europe as the coalition states realized they could not defeat Napoleon with old-style armies. Prussia introduced universal military service after its humiliating defeat in 1806, reforming its entire military system along French lines. Austria and Russia followed suit, though more slowly. By the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the age of small professional armies was over. The era of mass conscript armies, mobilized by national passion and industrial logistics, had begun. That shift carried a darker consequence: the emergence of what historians would later call total war. The Napoleonic conflict was not simply a series of battles between armies. It was a war that consumed entire societies. The continental system affected every merchant and farmer. The Peninsular Campaign involved guerrilla warfare that blurred the line between soldier and civilian. The invasion of Russia destroyed not just an army, but the land itself. Napoleon understood that wars were won not only on the battlefield, but by controlling resources, economies, and civilian morale. He ordered the burning of villages to deny supplies to the enemy. He imposed blockades that starved whole regions, and he demanded contributions of money and goods from conquered populations. The line between combatant and non-combatant became dangerously thin. This was a new kind of conflict, one that would foreshadow the industrialized wars of the 20th century. The most powerful and lasting transformation, however, was the spread of nationalism. Napoleon did not invent national identity, but his conquests acted as a catalyst. When French armies marched into the German states, they dismantled the old patchwork of hundreds of tiny principalities and replaced them with larger, more centralized entities. They introduced the Napoleonic Code, which treated all citizens equally under law, and they promoted the French language as a unifying tool. The German people, who had long seen themselves as subjects of local princes, began to imagine a larger community, a German nation. Poets and intellectuals like Johann Gottlieb Fichte gave fiery speeches calling for a unified Germany to throw off the foreign yoke. The same process unfolded in Italy. The French occupation of the peninsula sparked a desire for a single Italian state, an idea that had been dormant for centuries. Secret societies like the Carbonari began to plot for independence and unity. In Spain, the resistance against Napoleon took the form of a popular uprising that was explicitly national. The Spanish people fought not for a king, but for Spain itself, and they used the word patria, fatherland, with a fervor that had not been seen before. These nationalist movements were not extinguished when Napoleon fell. They grew stronger in the decades that followed, eventually leading to the unification of Italy in 1861 and Germany in 1871. The wars also shifted the fundamental nature of political conflict. Before the Revolution, wars were dynastic. Kings fought kings over inheritance and territory. After Napoleon, wars became ideological. They were fought between different visions of how society should be organized: monarchy versus republic, aristocracy versus meritocracy, tradition versus reform. The Congress of Vienna tried to suppress this ideological dimension, but it could not. The revolutions of 1830 and 1848 erupted across Europe, fueled by the very ideas that Napoleon had spread, even though he had personally abandoned them. The balance of power that emerged from the Congress of Vienna was designed to prevent any single nation from dominating Europe again. The great powers, Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and later France, maintained a careful equilibrium through alliances and occasional conferences. This system, often called the Concert of Europe, succeeded in preventing a general war on the scale of the Napoleonic Wars for almost 100 years. There were regional conflicts, the Crimean War, the wars of German unification, but they were limited in scope and duration compared to the continent-wide cataclysm of 1800 through to 1815. The shadow of Napoleon haunted the entire 19th century. Every ruler, every statesman, every general measured themselves against his example. The French continued to debate his legacy, alternating between celebrating him as a national hero and condemning him as a tyrant. The rest of Europe treated him as a cautionary tale, a warning against the dangers of unchecked ambition. And yet, his reforms, his legal code, his administrative system, his metric measures, all became part of the fabric of modern life. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, after the First World War had shattered the concert of Europe and unleashed the very kind of total war that Napoleon had pioneered, the ghost of the empire still lingered in the trenches, in the maps, in the laws. The man who had tried to conquer the world had not just left a memory. He had left a new world, one that his enemies and his admirers alike were forced to inherit. What remains when the empire crumbles and the emperor fades into exile? The answer is not simply a pile of ruined armies or a list of defeated battles. It is a story that still grips the world 2 centuries later. A story of a boy from a tiny Mediterranean island who climbed to the height of human power, only to be shattered by his own ambition. That trajectory, from the muddy streets of Ajaccio to the cold rock of St. Helena, is one of the most dramatic arcs in all of history. And it is precisely because it contains so many contradictions that it continues to fascinate. Napoleon was a liberator who brought the equalizing force of the Napoleonic Code to feudal Europe. Yet he was also a tyrant who crushed democratic movements and restored slavery in the colonies. He was a reformer who built schools, banks, and roads. Yet he was a warmonger who sent millions to die in the frozen fields of Russia and the sun-baked plains of Spain. He promised stability, yet he brought the continent to the brink of total war. This duality is the key to his lasting power. We cannot simply call him a hero or a villain. He was both, and he was neither. He was a man of the Enlightenment who believed in reason and progress, but he also believed that those gifts had to be imposed by force. He destroyed the old order of kings and princes, but he replaced it with a new order that was just as absolute, just as hungry for control. His genius for strategy and organization was matched only by his blindness to the limits of his own power. He could not see that an empire built on conquest must eventually face a coalition too large to defeat, or that a system of control might alienate the very people it was meant to rule. The fatal mistakes, the invasion of Russia, the Peninsular War, the blockade of Britain, all grew from the same root, an unstoppable drive that could not recognize when to stop. And yet, the meaning of his empire is not simply a cautionary tale about overreach. It is also a testament to how one individual can bend the arc of history. The legal systems, the administrative structures, the metric measures, the very way we think about citizenship and nationality, all carry his fingerprints. He did not invent these ideas, but he stamped them onto the continent with such force that they could not be erased. The old world that the Congress of Vienna tried to restore could not last, because Napoleon had already planted the seeds of modern Europe. The revolutions of 1830 and 1848, the unification of Italy and Germany, even the structure of the European Union itself, all trace a line back to those 15 years of imperial ambition. So why does this story still fascinate us? Because it is not just about one man. It is about the eternal human struggle between ambition and limits, between the desire to shape the world and the reality that the world resists being shaped. Napoleon saw himself as a force of destiny, a man who could will history into a new shape. And for a decade, he almost did. But history is not a single will. It is the collision of a million wills, and his finally collided with a continent that would not bow. That lesson, that no matter how brilliant the strategist, no matter how loyal the army, there comes a point where the system cannot stretch further, is a lesson that resonates across every era. If you enjoyed this journey through the rise and fall of the Napoleonic Empire, Take a moment to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next deep dive into the lives of history's most mythic figures. And tell us in the comments, what moment of Napoleon's story stunned you the most? The crossing of the Alps, the coronation at Notre Dame, the burning of Moscow, or the final farewell at Fontainebleau? Your favorite moment might inspire our next video.